Now let's move on to the last thing the NIEM uses extensive referencing to implement, and that would be metadata. Now it's a little odd. Metadata is data about other data. Basically, if something describes the other data as a piece of data, then it's metadata. It's kind of one step removed. Now normally XML uses attributes for metadata, but as I mentioned way back, the NIEM hardly uses attributes at all except for as infrastructure, which you've seen extensively with the referencing with all the IDs and refs, things like that. Instead, the NIEM puts metadata into its own metadata object. Now here are just a few examples of metadata from the NIEM. Things like last updated date. Here's a piece of information. What's the last updated date of that piece of information as a piece of information? Reporting person text. Who's the person who reported that piece of information? Or an expiration date. When does a piece of information expire? As a piece of information, when does it expire? And these are all chunks of metadata in the NIEM, and they're all represented by actual elements instead of attributes. Why? Because then you can gain all the flexibility you have of full elements. Metadata elements in the NIEM can be full-blown things that they can be elements that hold other elements. They can be dates, they can be text, they can be numbers. They can take advantage of all the descriptive advantages that elements have, whereas attributes are very limited. They're just strings. In the NIEM, objects point to metadata objects which are applicable to them. It's kind of the opposite of how roles work. Remember, roles point to the objects playing the role. It's the other way around in metadata. The object points at the chunks of metadata that apply to it. So if I'm an object and that last expired date thing, that applies to me, then I point to that and say that's that metadata that applies to me. That said, multiple objects can point to the same metadata. Since the metadata is the target of the reference, you can have one chunk of metadata and a whole lot of objects point to it, and they've all got their own pointers to it. And that's a very common thing. You may get a whole chunk of information with the same expiration date because it all comes from the same ultimate source, and they would all share the same chunk of metadata. But objects can also point to multiple metadata objects as well. So you can have multiple chunks of metadata for each object. The NIEM provides an existing metadata object inside of which is a whole lot of metadata type information. So you can just use that as is if it meets your needs. If it doesn't meet your needs, then you can create your own metadata objects by extending metadata type. And metadata type is in the structure's namespace. But you can extend from that as well and make your own metadata objects with the kind of metadata you want. Now, so far we've seen the ref attribute being used to connect things together. When we're dealing with metadata, instead we use a metadata attribute. And it works pretty much the same way in that it holds IDs of the objects that it's pointing to. One difference is, though, that the metadata attribute can hold multiple IDs. You just separate them by spaces. That should tell you something. IDs shouldn't have spaces in them, especially if you're going to use metadata to do multiple IDs. But other than that, it works just like ref. It has values in it that point to the IDs of objects having those IDs. Now the difference is, instead of it being like the person object with the ID, it's the chunk of metadata with the ID, and the person object or whatever piece of information would have the metadata attribute pointing to the ID where the metadata is. Let's go take a look at some of this in schema. Here is part of the NIEM core's metadata type. So we have metadata type, and inside of it you'll see things like administrative ID, comment text, publisher name, release date, repository ID, source text, and there's a whole bunch more that we had to delete in order to get it all on the screen. And then there's a metadata element defined of that type. And so you can use that if that sort of metadata meets your needs. But as I said, if you don't have what you need, you can make your own. Let's see what Cyphus did. Here is the metadata piece from Cyphus. Now you can see that it extends from sMetadata type just as the NIEM course metadata object did. And what it adds is it adds a creation date, a last updated tracking ID, and most importantly, a protected health information indicator, PHI. Now if you work at all in children, youth, and family services, you are familiar with protected health information, and you're familiar with how important it is to be able to mark things as being protected health information. By putting it in as metadata in Cyphus, this means this chunk of metadata can be applied to anything in the whole NIEM, in the whole model, in all the domains. I can have any chunk of information I want, and I can have that information point to a metadata block that says protected health information indicator equals true, basically. And I can say that to any piece of information. And that's the neat thing about metadata, is you apply it to pieces of information as pieces of information. And it's a lot cleaner to do it this way than to have every single element in the NIEM be able to have a protected health information indicator inside of it. Then at the bottom, we just make a metadata element to be of this type. And so inside that metadata element would be the protected health information indicator. So here's what the metadata looks like in the instance document. The first object we see there is a CIFS metadata object, and instead we give it an ID, ID 0004, just an internal ID for this particular document on this slide. And inside of it is one of the pieces from the CIFS metadata object, the creation date, and inside of there is the actual date, and we did 2012-0101, and the end of the metadata block. Then we created a second metadata object, this time the NIEM CORS metadata object, gave it a different ID. Each of the IDs has to be unique within this document. And inside of there, we're using the source text element, and inside of there, telephone directory. And then down at the bottom is a person object, and the person object is where we actually point to the chunks of metadata that apply to it. So the person as a whole, and we're not talking about the person, we're talking about the person as data. Remember, metadata is data about data. So we've got this person object, and it has a metadata link that says, hey, look, my metadata is whatever metadata has ID 0004. And we see, metadata 0004, creation date is blah, blah, blah. Now, does that mean the person's creation date? That's their birth date? No. It's talking about the chunk of information. It's talking about the information about this person. The information itself has a creation date of 2012-0101. Not the person itself. Metadata is about the data as data and not about the real world object that the data is representing. It's about this actual data here. The data itself was created on 2012-0101. Then we look a little further, and inside the person we have a person name, and the person name has metadata as well. How do we know which metadata? We follow the link. We go ID 0005, and we find the metadata piece with that ID, and we see source text telephone directory. What this is telling us is that the name came from a telephone directory. That's the source text. I just made this up. But again, it's not saying the person got their name from the telephone directory. They got their name from their parents. We're saying this piece of information as a piece of information came from a telephone directory. And that's what the NIEM means when it talks about metadata. It's talking about information about the information itself as information and not about the real world objects that the information is representing. So let's do a quick exercise using metadata. Using the snippet of schema I'm going to give you on the next slide, plus that person object we've been using all along in our exercises, create an instance document marking the person's eye color as being protected health information. I know eye color probably isn't, but for the sake of the exercise, mark the eye color as being protected health information. Here's the little bit of schema that you need in order to do this. Again, this is the CIFS metadata type, and we saw it earlier in the example. And what we've done is we've just carved it down to the protected health information indicator. It does have a couple more things in it, but for the sake of the exercise, that's how we're putting in it. And then we have an element called metadata that is of metadata type, so that's the holder for that protected health information indicator. And then we need to have the element name itself there as well. So protected health information indicator, and it's a Boolean, so it just takes a true-false value. So quickly whip that together. And here's our solution. Now what I've done is I've added it to this ongoing solution set that we've had to show all the stuff, and it all kind of fits together. At the very top we have that person object with an ID 0001, and at the very bottom now we've appended a metadata object. We've given it an ID of 0005 so it doesn't conflict with the other IDs that we have. And inside of that is a protected health information indicator, and we've set it equal to true. Now, frankly, there may not be any reason to ever set that to false. I guess the implication is if you don't have that as metadata, something isn't protected. But we want to say this is protected health information, set the indicator equal to true. Then if we go back up to the person object, we see person eye color text has metadata. It says metadata equals ID 0005. And what that tells us is to go find the metadata piece with that ID, and that will tell us the metadata for this person's eye color text. So we go down and we find it, and we see, oh, that's our metadata block at the bottom. Protected health information indicator equals true. This person's eye color text is protected health information. And that's how we apply that kind of metadata to something in the NIEM. Now, before we move on to our next and last topic in this section, I wanted to quickly review the hierarchical relational XML diagram from way at the beginning. Remember I said that NIEM exchanges tend to not be these deep hierarchies that you typically see in XML, but instead are a bunch of peer-level objects that are linked together with various relationships. Having looked at the results of that last exercise, this diagram should make a little more sense now, because what we have in that previous solution is a person object, metadata objects, association objects, a school object, and then links that link all these different things together. What we have is very much like what this diagram shows, a bunch of peer-level objects with relationships linking them together. That's why the NIEM ends up looking this way, because the NIEM has these rich sets of relationships and associations to hook the various things together.